Jay Solomon is the chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and for nearly two decades he's written all over the world, from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and he's been nominated for 3 Pulitzer Prizes. The book he's going to talk about tonight is indicative of how illustrious and intrepid reporter he is. It's called The Iran Wars: Spy Games, Bank Battles, and the Secret Deals That Reshaped the Middle East, and he'll be happy to meet every one of you and sign copies of it after this event. Former Secretary of State George Shultz, also an alumni of the Nixon administration, calls the Iran Wars illuminating, a deeply researched account of the Iranian nuclear negotiations and their implications, and important to understanding the short-term and long-term consequences of how we manage this difficult relationship. It's very relevant, especially as we transition into this new era of politics. Ladies and gentlemen, Jay Solomon.
Thank you for being here. It's an honor. As Jonathan was saying, I feel a special privilege to be speaking at the Nixon Library. As he was mentioning, my father, Richard Solomon, worked for President Nixon on China and was part of what was the so-called China card, the secret outreach to the Chinese during the Nixon administration. And having grown up kind of seeing that world around me, it definitely influenced me in my journalism and covering the Obama administration and what was their secret outreach, which to the Iranians. I definitely saw some parallels, and I felt like I was reliving my youth in some ways, although, as I'll get to later, I think I'm a little less sanguine that the Iranian outreach, that the secret diplomacy with the Iranians will have as huge of an impact or profound of an impact as President Nixon's outreach to the Chinese did, but we can get into that later. I'd like to start first just giving a bit of a sense of the background of the book. I really started to get fixated on Iran towards the end of the Bush administration. The war in Iraq was playing out. There was the war in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. Afghanistan was still brewing, and it was at that time I started to really detect these patterns, that what was going on in these conflicts was more than just local Sunni Shia violence or a war between Israel and Hezbollah in the Lebanon case, that there was a much broader conflict that was brewing. In this case, it was the United States and its allies, including Israel and the Arab states, and on the other side of the coin, it was Iran. And what I heard for the first time, the term when I was in Lebanon in 2006, the axis of resistance, they call it, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and its regional allies, whether it's the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Islamic Jihad and Hamas in the Palestinian territories, various Shia militia in Iraq or in Yemen, that it was at this time I started to really get a sense that, wow, there is something much broader brewing here than just local wars, that this is a broader conflict at work. And it was also towards the end of the Bush administration that I started to detect, and you could see it in a lot of other reporting, that there were basically new forms of national security, new forms of warfare that were being developed by the United States, very much to contain the Iranian threat, whether it was the growing threat of their nuclear program or just their regional presence. And there has been a lot written about the cyber warfare, which was launched towards the end of the Bush administration into Obama, which was using cyber attacks against the Iranian nuclear facilities. But I think more so to me, and definitely in the book, was the financial warfare that was being cooked up against the Iranian regime. There was a lot of skepticism actually early on that the United States could actually take on a country which had such a big oil economy that was, depending on the years, was the second, third, fourth largest member of OPEC. There was a lot of skepticism that you could actually do damage to an Iranian economy of that size. And it was towards the end of the Obama administration, the Bush administration, that these tools started to really be refined, and that really focused me more on the Iranian threat as a journalist going into the Obama administration. And a huge part of this book also is just is the story of Barack Obama and why this son of Hawaii, who grew up partly in Indonesia and some of these other places, why did he get so kind of obsessed with a rapprochement with Iran? And it really does, and I get to it in the book, it starts really at the going into the 2008 presidential campaign. It was the one issue he started to lock on to, that he talked a lot about making peace with various enemies, whether it was Cuba or potentially the North Koreans or the Syrians, but it was Iran that really fixated his attention, and you could start to see that in the 2008 campaign. And the question I always get is why was Obama so fixated on Iran? Why, of all the other issues? And I think I really try to hone in on the fact that in Obama's mind, Iran was kind of a nexus for a lot of different issues that he wanted to tackle. He had aides of his, whether it was Ben Rhodes or Dennis McDonough, who took big jobs in his administration, who had worked on something called the Iraq Study Group towards the end of the Bush administration. And it basically concluded that the U.S. wanted to extract itself from Iraq, wind down these wars. The United States needed to have a dialogue with Iran and Syria because they were the ultimate sort of, they could wreck whatever the United States was doing in there. So that was part of it. It was Obama's, of the issues he really focused on in Congress, nuclear proliferation was one that he was really interested in, and he saw Iran as kind of, if this country got a nuclear weapon, it would have a cascading effect. So the Iran focus was also a non-proliferation. It was a non-proliferation issue, and it was, as many of you probably remember, when Obama took power, the first big speeches he gave in Cairo and other places was about ending the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Iran as one of the major kind of external players through its funding of Hezbollah and Hamas and some of these groups. It was, in Obama's view, he could somehow, rapprochement with Iran could help settle the Arab-Israeli conflict. So all of these issues were kind of circulating in Obama's mind in 2008 and as he took power. And I also do think his background, he whether it was living in Indonesia or Hawaii or some of these countries, I think he bought into the belief that Iran was a country that had suffered from whether it was British or American machinations over time, and that he, as a kind of a young leader, could reach out to the Iranians, even though his interlocutor would be the Ayatollah Khomeini in some ways, who's not exactly a chipper young guy. But this was in his mind as he took power. And what was interesting and is a key part of this book is just how quickly Obama did start to act on this Iran card, this Iran game, and it really was, I think, on the foreign side, his driving policy. He started to write secret letters to the supreme leader within just months of taking office, where he started to basically expound on what I was saying, that there have been American mistakes in Iran through its history, and we recognize that if we can come to some sort of agreement on constraining the nuclear program of Iran, we can work on different areas. He started to give speeches on Iranian New Year, describing the country as the Islamic Republic, which is not something most U.S. presidents had ever used before. So he set the table very early for what would be this diplomatic strategy, and it was very calculated. And I think the book, in a lot of ways, is very complimentary, or that there was an extremely effective diplomacy in a lot of ways in setting up what would be the negotiations that started in secret in 2012. There was such diversity of countries that President Obama needed to calculate into his mind as he started to set this path. It was, the Israelis that were very hawkish. The Saudis, some of the other Gulf states were probably even more hawkish in some ways, trying to bring them on board. At the same time, you had European countries that really wanted to trade with Iran. The Russians and the Chinese in particular were getting so much energy from Iran, trying to devise sort of a strategy that brought together these very differing viewpoints. It was not an easy tack, and I think Obama was successful in kind of flipping the card. I do think when he took power, there was the mentality that the Iranian nuclear program was kind of, it was America's fault. The Bush administration had been antagonizing the Iranians or wasn't serious about negotiating, and Obama, by so kind of aggressively focusing on this diplomacy and showing his willingness to talk, I think was very successful in kind of flipping that mentality. And I don't think I can stress enough just how effective the financial war was. If you trace it back, and I think I do pretty concretely in the book, it really starts in there were sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran going back basically since the revolution in 79 of some sort. But in 2006, as Iran's nuclear program starts to advance, and with the then President Ahmadinejad in power kind of really stirring the pot of this kind of radical international agenda, the U.S. Treasury Department really started to map out what was a very specific escalating steps of sanctions, which started with basically the big state banks, and this moved up the chain to include insurance companies, airlines, shipping companies, and eventually the Central Bank of Iran, which the United States, the Treasury Department saw as kind of the nuclear option in the economic war, because even while all of these ideas were being cooked up, these strategies, you had first Hank Paulson and then Timothy Geithner, the secretaries of the Treasury, and other economic planners extremely worried about the economic fallout of attacking Iran's oil, that there would be a huge spike in global energy prices, and that this would boomerang back to the United States. And what was impressive in that first term was the elaborate meetings the U.S. government had with the Chinese, the Indians, the Koreans, the big energy buyers, basically saying, look, you guys are worried that there's going to be a war, potentially the Israelis could strike. The best thing you could do to avert that and potentially subvert your own energy purchases is to help us implement sanctions against the Iranian government. And to do that, we will get the Saudis, Kuwait, the UAE, and even the United States in some ways to up our own production of energy to offset the Iranian market, and we'll basically displace the Iranians from the market. And it worked pretty incredibly. Some of it was luck in that the global economy was slowing, but this was a very thought out escalating step of sanctions that ultimately included as well basically kicking the Iranians completely off the international banking system, which started in 2012 in the most concrete steps when they were basically banned from using something called the SWIFT network. So Iran, going into the second term of President Obama's tenure, was basically, in some ways, being forced to just do barter trade. They were basically trading oil to get software or tea. It really took a country which was a globalized economy, even though it's it's got this revolutionary government to a barter economy, and that was not an easy task to achieve. But at the same time, while the book highlights what was a very successful diplomacy, economic strategy in a lot of ways, the book outlines what I think were severe, heavy costs that probably got somewhat displaced or kind of overshadowed, or the White House very much kind of tried to play these down as the nuclear agreement came and this big battle in Congress happened. First of all, I would say the fact that so much of what Obama did was done in secret, as far as negotiations, which started with the Iranians in the Sultanate of Oman in 2012, was basically done behind the back of our key allies. The Israelis, the Saudis, even most of the Europeans did not know that the Americans had started this track in Oman. And even though I think maybe not the Israelis and the Saudis, but most of the Europeans would probably have supported it, the fact that this was done behind their back did breed distrust in a lot of ways. And I think what we're seeing in the Middle East now can't be totally disassociated, because I think there was, particularly with the Saudis and some of the Gulf states, distrust that the United States was really a key ally, that they weren't trying to pull some fast one and realign the United States behind Iran, which before the Islamic Revolution was kind of the linchpin of U.S. security in a lot of ways in the Persian Gulf. So I think what you're seeing in Yemen, for example, or in Syria, where there's such a vicious sectarian conflict, and the Saudis and some of these countries have kind of in a lot of ways gone their own way, I think that you can't disassociate this in some ways from the fact that Obama and his team did this diplomacy behind their back, and it started in secret. And another really momentous event that kind of is forgotten, I think, in some ways, was the revolution in 2009, or the uprising in Iran called the Green Movement, where you had millions of Iranians take to the streets to contest the re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And there was intense discussions inside the Oval Office in the White House. I feel like we're there right now. Back in 2009, about what the United States should do. Should the U.S. come out in support of the Green Movement, or stay quiet, or do nothing? And I think I tried to appreciate this was not an easy decision. This was a very complicated situation where you had some Iranian activist opposition leaders telling the Obama administration, basically, don't say anything. If you come out and support us in any really public way, the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guards, will basically use this as an excuse to crack down, will be branded as lackeys. So basically, stay out of it. But then there were others basically saying, look, this is going to happen anyways. We're going to be branded as Western tools, so at least come out and give some public statements to give us cover that will put the supreme leader, that will put the Revolutionary Guards on their back foot, so they might be less willing to use violence or force. And basically, Obama came down on the choice to do anything for the first week, 10 days, which were the crucial points. He did so to the point where he basically gave a stand down to the CIA and some of the other intelligence agencies not to try to, maybe it wasn't a question of putting arms or anything, but kind of working networks inside Iran to see what can be achieved. He basically did a stand down order. And also, it was interesting, some of his earliest comments President Obama made during this crunch time were kind of questioning whether this movement would amount to anything. Maybe what we get after this is even worse. And I think part of this was President Obama, after the Bush administration, was kind of reluctant in getting involved. But I also documented, which I think is compelling, that he had this track with the supreme leader of Iran in place. He wanted to solve this nuclear question, and to see some tumult, which the United States was going to be kind of blamed for, was not what he wanted. So this was factoring in his brain, and I interviewed in the book senior U.S. White House officials who said, yeah, that was part of the calculation, that this revolution is probably not going to go anywhere, or it could go worse. So let's stay out of it, but let's keep this track open to the supreme leader. And I think it is interesting that Obama seemed to have learned from past administrations. Whether you look at what's striking about U.S. history with Iran since the Islamic Revolution is just how damaging politically it has been for U.S. leaders. Jimmy Carter lost the election in '80, and one factor is widely seen was the hostage crisis, that he was seen as sort of feckless, that he ended up shipping $12 billion to the Islamic Republic to get the hostages out. You had the Iran-Contra scandal under Ronald Reagan, which was a classic case of communications going to everyone but the supreme leader in a lot of ways, and he was getting burned. So I think President Obama kind of learned from that, and that's why you saw such a reluctance. And in retrospect, it is striking when you think how quiet the United States was on Iran compared to what we did just 2 years later, which was to openly call for Hosni Mubarak to step down in Egypt. We used military force in Libya to unseat Muammar Gaddafi, and at least initially a pretty aggressive effort to unseat Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And I know this kind of discontinuity has kind of compounded the conspiracy theories in the Middle East, or the belief that Obama was trying to kind of redirect the United States alliances in the Middle East to kind of recreate this alliance that we had with Iran back in the 70s. And I think the third real costly kind of issue that was tied to the nuclear negotiations was the Syrian rebellion and U.S. policy regarding the civil war there. What was interesting in this book was there were things happening in real term as a reporter that you were reporting on, that it was only going back in retrospect that you started to piece more things together. And what I think everyone remembered in the summer of 2013 was President Obama basically said, if the Assad regime uses chemical weapons against its own people, we will use military force. This is a red line that they can't cross. And this was basically announced in August of 2013. And then he quickly U-turned. And I think there were a number of factors involved. There wasn't great congressional support. The Brits backed out. But what no one knew at the time, and I certainly didn't, was that the Obama administration was having these high-level negotiations with the Iranians in Oman, to the point that what became this interim nuclear agreement, which constrained their program and basically froze sanctions at the time, was that these negotiations were at a very advanced level in Oman. And as part of the book, I discussed with Iranian officials what would have happened if the U.S. went ahead with bombing the Assad regime, which is Iran's closest ally in the region. It provides Iran's strategic depth. It's the conduit for Iranian supplies and finances going into Lebanon and to the Palestinian rejectionist groups. Iranian officials told me, we wouldn't have been able to have sustained the negotiations. The supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guards would have basically said, look, we're going to pull the plug. We can't negotiate with a country that's basically targeting our closest ally. The White House to this day is very adamant that these two policies were not connected, that the decisions in Syria to basically stay out were not affected by Iran. But if you look what has happened since then over the past 3 years, is the U.S. policy in some ways has kind of U-turned from seeking Assad's overthrow to kind of trying to align ourselves, certainly with the Russians, who in turn are closely aligned with the Iranians. And some of these letters that President Obama was sending to the supreme leader during this time, and we reported them and got a pretty good readout about them, was that, look, you should know that while we are launching military strikes in Syria against the Islamic State, we are not targeting the Assad regime. And this was communicated through Iraqi military forces as well. So you could see this kind of realignment happening, whether it was calculated or was just driven by this concern about getting embroiled or the fear of getting seeing the nuclear negotiations blow up. This was all impacting Obama's thinking, his calculations. In 2012, going into 2013, the secret talks become public. And a good part of the book, I try to outline what John Kerry and President Obama were thinking as the negotiations became public. And I think it's here where the book is probably the most critical, because I really do think the U.S. and its allies were very strategic in setting up the negotiations, basically taking Iran off the oil markets, cutting them off from the banking system. And as the negotiations started, the price of oil started to collapse. So you had the leverage of the United States and its allies was increasing as the talks were accelerating. But I felt, and I'm still sort of surprised by it, the United States was kind of acting in a way that they didn't have the cards. At the time, kind of there was a concrete period of time that they had to get a deal. And I give some of the concrete examples I saw that was essentially the U.S. giving up its leverage was military forces. For one example, the United States would say in public, all cards remains on the table, but in private, they'd tell journalists or other diplomats, look, if we really were to bomb the Iranians, this would guarantee they get a nuclear weapon. They basically go into a bunker mentality, and they have the understanding, they have the rationale. So they kind of convinced themselves that military force was never going to happen. I think the Iranians knew that. Another factor which I found fascinating was the interplay between the United States and Israel. In the first term, they were very much using Israel and the threat of force to leverage other countries to basically sanction Iran. But in 2011 and 2012, there was a real growing fear inside the White House that the Israelis might attack, or that there could be an escalation in tensions. This was the time where there was a spat of assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists in Tehran, and in turn there were heaps of plots that were traced back to Iran or Hezbollah, targeting largely Israeli assets, whether it was tourists in Bulgaria or embassies in Kenya or India or Thailand, that the U.S. was very concerned that we could get sucked into a conflict, and that was driving the negotiations, and I think kind of creating a sense of this thing needs to be settled really fast. And I don't think it was a coincidence that the secret track started in 2012 as these fears of war escalated. And the other element of the negotiations where I think the U.S. kind of gave up leverage early on was not just the fact that it was communicated to the Iranians that they would be able to produce enriched uranium or produce nuclear fuel, which was kind of the cusp of the issue, but it was also that the United States started to really talk down the idea that the sanctions could go on, that the international kind of architecture was starting to crack, and because of that, there needed to be a deal, and a deal quickly, despite, in my view, the fact that the sanctions were holding almost too well, even till today, where you have an agreement, but Western banks are still terrified to go back into Iran because they faced such huge fines from the Treasury or the District Attorney of Manhattan that they were very worried of going back in there, and oil prices were collapsing. But the U.S. was putting out this perception that it was not, the sanctions weren't sustainable. And in these kind of interminable negotiations in Lausanne or Vienna or in Geneva, the Iranians seem to be sort of much more adept at playing this kind of double game. They had the supreme leader making very hawkish statements and the Iranian negotiators basically communicating to the U.S. side that, look, we've got this crazy man back. We have really strict red lines that we can't go back because these hardliners won't let us. But the U.S. was playing the exact opposite side. You had the Congress making very kind of threatening statements or saying we're not going to we're going to impose sanctions at a certain date if there's no deal. And John Kerry and Obama would be very aggressive in basically saying we're going to veto this or this, we're going to fight this. So I think the Iranians had a pretty good sense that these guys wanted a deal. And if you look where the where the U.S. went to the final deal, the U.S. initial position was Iran can't enrich uranium, they can't have a ballistic missile program, they can't fund arms in the region. They need to, these were basically the starting lines. And if you look where the ultimate agreement went, the Iranians basically got most of what they wanted. They are allowed to keep an industrial scale nuclear program in 10 years, or allowed to have that. The missile embargo is going to be lifted, and it's not really being enforced anymore. The arms embargo, as far as its ability to ship, is being lifted. So they got a lot, and I think Obama's calculation, if you look what they gave up, is that this is a political bet, that the supreme leader is 77, 78 years old. He's not in great health, that even if Iran has this capacity in 10 or 15 years, it's going to be a very different political calculation there. It's going to be, we could probably live with Iran if the politics change. And I don't think that is a crazy calculation because anyone who's been to Iran, I mean, most of the stereotypes are true. It's a young population. It is very pro-American for the Middle East. And this calculation could prove true. I guess what concerns me is 18 months after the agreement, there really has not been kind of any rapprochement to speak of. And tracing back to the China card and what happened with Nixon, you had a country in China at the time that wanted to face off with the Soviet Union, that wanted to open its economy, that wanted to be kind of engaged with the United States. I still don't see where this commonality is with the Iranians yet. The hope would be some sort of cooperation in Syria, and there was a lot of discussions on the sidelines of some of these negotiations in Vienna in 2015, that once we get this nuclear deal, there'll be cooperation in Syria. But in reality, the exact opposite happened. We now know through our reporting, and it's in the book, that the Russians and the Iranians were sort of secretly having their own side negotiations where they were plotting a joint military operation to basically save the Assad regime, which happened just weeks after the nuclear agreement was signed. The Russians started bombing, and the Iranians really started to mobilize their own forces, Hezbollah and other Shiite militias from across the region to safeguard the Iranian regime. With the deal done, everyone now really wants to know, what does the future hold? What's going to happen under a President Trump? My initial reaction to Trump, and no one really knows, was that this guy is, he's talking tough, but he's a businessman, he's a trader. And he said it a bunch of times in the campaign trail, like, wow, the Europeans and the Asians are trading with Iran. Why are our companies, basically getting cut out? So I think that is part of his worldview. But at the same time, if you see the people he's put in place around him, whether it's General Mattis at the Pentagon, or Congressman Pompeo at the CIA, or General Flynn at the National Security Council, these guys aren't just skeptical of Iran. These guys are basically hard-nosed guys who fought with the Iranians in Iraq and are regime change proponents in a lot of ways. So giving that calculation, I looking over the next year, see a very bumpy road. I think the Obama administration got into a pattern where the terms of the nuclear agreement, whether the U.S. was really bending over backward to try to basically help the Iranians implement the deal, whether it was buying some of the materials that they weren't supposed to be producing, or turning a basically very cautious voice on Iranian missile tests or military operations in Yemen. That is not going to happen under a Trump administration, I think. So I don't think either side is kind of hunkering for a conflict starting in the next 6 months. But if you look at kind of what the mindset is, a lot of these advisors to Trump and what the Iranian regime continues to be doing, this is why I think I'm skeptical that this kind of broad rapprochement that President Obama really wished and kind of talked about back in 2008, I am pretty skeptical that is going to happen. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that's where the Iran wars kind of situate itself today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Jay has agreed to answer your questions. I'd like to ask the first question. How do you think, after Khomeini steps down or passes away, what does the future of Iran politically look like?
I mean, the hope here, again, and I think this was definitely part of the Obama administration calculation, is, yeah, this guy's 77, 78. The generation of Iranian military officers and leaders who fought in the Iran-Iraq War, who basically overthrew the Shah, are going to be passing from the scene, and you will get this younger generation that is younger. And I think it's definitely a possibility, and I don't kind of rule that out. I guess if you really look at the kind of the economics of Iran, and I think this is where maybe people get too kind of blindsided by philosophy or the revolutionary dogma, is that it's become sort of an oligarchy. If you look at the Revolutionary Guard, the elite military unit, sort of the shock troops of the supreme leader, I've talked to businessmen who are trying to sort of promote business with Iran in this post-deal environment. And they say if you're a big company that wants to do a deal in Iran, there's only something like 15 to 20% of the companies there that aren't controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. So it really is kind of an oligarchy, and I think there's a threat that the money that does go in there is not going to sort of go to your layman. It's going to entrench this regime, and I think that's part of the reason there was such shock or concern over the summer when it came out that the U.S. had sent nearly $2 billion in just flat cash to the Iranians as part of this kabuki dance to get American prisoners back, that this money is not going to go to the layman. It's going to go to the regime, and some of the names that are starting to circulate around as replacements for the supreme leader in some ways are equally as hawkish as a leader. So the hope is that, yeah, the system business kind of loosens up the country and you're not as worried in 10 years, but I think when you look at the economics and the who controls what, it's not as kind of simple as maybe people would hope.
Hey, nicely done.
Thanks.
With all of the billions of dollars they have in oil money and money we've given back, how can they not have a nuclear weapon? I mean, seriously.
Right now.
There's enough people out there that might sell them one under the table. How do we stop that?
Well, I think one of the interesting parts of doing the book was kind of tracing back what they had been doing. And there was this famous intelligence estimate that was put out by the United States in 2007 that basically concluded they had a very coordinated weaponization program, but we think they might have stopped in 2003. And then the International Atomic Energy Agency came out with a report last year that said, well, we think they might have had it going to some level in 2009. But I think one of the most damning parts of the nuclear agreement was basically the fact that the U.S. agreed to kind of whitewash what was this international investigation into the weaponization program. If you looked at the terms of the deal, the Iranians were in some ways supposed to put forward nuclear scientists who had been involved, documentation, access to military sites, and virtually almost none of that happened. But the kind of the ball had been rolling. The deal was, the powers wanted the deal done. And one of the stories I'm still amazed that got kind of overlooked was that the UN's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, did get access a year ago in October into this one military site. And they did some studies, and they actually did find enriched uranium there. And even the US official said, well, there's no real reason for that, except that it must have been part of some of these weapon tests. But we think this happened a decade ago, so we're going to just basically, go on. But I do think when you have this understanding of that they did have this knowledge, that they, in 10 years, can produce basically weapons-grade uranium on an industrial scale, or 10 or 15 years as basically legally under this agreement, and they're continuing to develop this missile program, I think there'll be a kind of a latent weapons state. And I think one of the dangers that was kind of downplayed is that whether it's the Saudis or the Egyptians or the Turks, they're looking at where Iran is going to be in 10 and 15 years, knowing what they have, knowing that the issue of weaponization was never really addressed, and they're going to start kind of gaming it out. I don't think the Iranians really need to buy it from anyone else because they have the capacity. It's maybe the Saudis buy it from the Pakistanis or something like that, but I do think the potential for a cascade is there, and the irony is the deal was supposed to totally cut this off. I mean, that's how it was sold. The deal was sold as both a kind of an arms agreement, but also almost like a peace treaty. And I think there's a risk that neither could actually bear fruit in the long term if there isn't this political change in that country.
A question in the front row.
The plane loads of cash over the summer. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that was part of easing the economic sanctions, or how much of a role did that play in releasing hostages? Was it a ransom payment?
I mean, that was one of the more fascinating stories over the last few years because, you had this weird kind of confluence of events in January of last year where the nuclear agreement went into implementation phase, the sanctions were released, and these Americans flew home, and then kind of the State Department put out like a one-paragraph press release saying, "Oh, we resolved this decades-old dispute tracing back to the Shah's time over these weapons deals, and we paid them $1.7 billion." And it was kind of, I think a lot of reporters at the time was like, "Wow, the timing was bizarre." But over the months, we reported that this was delivered in cash, and this money was not released until the Americans were wheels up from Tehran. So was it ransom? Was it leverage, as the State Department called it? You do the math, but I think that's another part of the whole Iran deal that I think raises concerns, is that it's very transactional. There hasn't been kind of this broader kind of move towards rapprochement, which you had in China back in the 70s, whether it was Nixon visiting Beijing. John Kerry used to talk about hopefully visiting Iran before the end of the term, and there's just no way. I know Obama definitely wanted to have this kind of handshake moment with President Rouhani at the UN this year, but Rouhani basically avoided him because it would be political death to him back in Tehran. So I think when you look back at the history of the U.S. relationship with Iran since the revolution, whether it was the hostage crisis, Iran-Contra, this payment of literally pallets and pallets of cash to get Americans out, it comes across as a kind of extortionist kind of financial transaction. I think what worries me now is that there have been more Americans taken, almost all dual nationals in Iran over the past year, and you can hear from the Revolutionary Guards and others saying, like, you guys still owe us billions of dollars, and they're trying to cook up something similar. So is it financial leverage? Is it diplomacy? Is it ransom payment? I mean, people use different terms, but if you take a step back and look at the history, there's a pattern. It's thematic over the last 40 years.
We have a question right here.
Yes. Stop to realize that over 50% of the economies of the Arab countries, Russia and Venezuela, our major enemies is oil. We've got to get out of the oil business, out of the hydrocarbon business. And we need a Manhattan-type project like the Atomic Energy Commission in World War II to produce hydrogen-powered cars as Japan is now producing.
Thanks. Well, just one thing on the oil, because I did look at it a lot. I mean, it was interesting, the fact that the United States started to produce so much more oil and gas domestically over the past 6 years. That really did put Iran in a real bind, and it also put Russia in a real bind. So the fact that the U.S. did start producing a lot more energy has changed the dynamics in the Middle East in a lot of ways, and I think that's part of the reason now you see tensions a lot more with Saudi Arabia than there used to be, because the relationship going back decades was this kind of agreement where they provided us the energy, we provided them the security, but that dynamic has been shifting because we don't need as much energy as we used to, and our foreign policies start to be diverged. So I agree with you, though, that the energy calculation in all this is definitely an important. And I guess what's hard about it is Iran, looking at it as a country, you don't want to build it up to be 10 foot tall because its economy is still in really bad shape. With oil at these lower levels, it's not an economic power, and there is still a huge brain drain, and the younger people of there basically want to get out in a lot of ways. But what the Iranians were very effective at over the past decade, and in a lot of ways with an assist from the United States, particularly in Iraq, was playing this game of using militias and asymmetrical warfare to take much more power in countries like Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and I think the Iraq War, and I had a chapter in the book, really did play into the hands of the Iranians and gave them much more regional influence than they had when Saddam Hussein was still in power.
A question in the back row.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Going back to the earliest stages of the negotiations in Oman, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the need for secrecy during that phase of negotiations. You had mentioned that there was some sort of concern that if the Israelis or the Saudis found out, that there would have been issues. And I was wondering maybe if you could talk about precisely what would have happened had that secrecy that was present kind of at the beginning, had that not been present. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think on this point I was sympathetic in a lot of ways to the White House that, like, to start this process going, it had to be done in secret. Whether the Israelis and the Saudis have a lot of lobbyists and allies in Washington, that if word had gotten out that we were starting to talk to the Iranians, there might have been an effort to sort of undercut the process or to start talking it down even earlier than they did, which, there was a very public campaign by these countries to basically talk down the agreement. I guess if you accept the fact that there had to be secrecy early on to get the process early on, I think the problem in a lot of ways was that these countries who were the players in the region who had the most at stake were cut out. And this was a lot different than, if you remember under the Clinton administration in the 90s, we had these negotiations with the North Koreans, which ultimately failed. But the biggest proponents of those negotiations in a lot of ways were the Japanese and the South Koreans, who were terrified of a conflict and actually did play, had seats at the table in those negotiations, which brought a deal that ultimately failed. But it was the fact that these countries were kind of looking from the outside in and were so critical of the process was always a risk that, it's not going to make the deal sustainable. And I do think when you look at the politics now of the Trump campaign, I saw Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke over the weekend, and the Israeli government really did make a conscious effort some point last year to basically stop complaining about this thing. This deal is done. It is what it is. Let's move forward. But this was the first time I had seen Netanyahu so publicly criticize the agreement. So I just wonder now that they see a new political calculation. They see who's in the White House, who's at the Pentagon now. This deal could get relitigated again in a totally new environment.
We have a question right here.
Thank you for the talk. And could you talk a little bit more about China and Russia's role and the interest in the Middle East? Because some experts say when the U.S. armies are stuck in the Middle East, like Chinese people will be happy, and because it would be hard for the U.S. to rebalance and go back to Asia. What's your, according to your reservation?
Sure. Looking at the Chinese role in particular was interesting because I do think there probably is some, desire on the strategic level to see the United States, bogged down in these conflicts in the Middle East, because President Obama did very much talk about the pivot to Asia from early on, and there were steps in that direction, but he kept getting dragged back into whether it was the Iraq conflict, ISIS in Syria. So I agree with you with that on some level, but at the same time, the Chinese really were very worried that either the Israelis could attack or that there could be a conflict in Iran, and a major source of Chinese energy would be cut off. And the United States understood that. So I think the Chinese weren't passive in that sense at all. They were very worried that this thing could undercut their economics. So they were probably weighing both of these things. The Chinese were kind of interesting at the actual negotiations because they seemed to sort of check out of the process. I noticed that when the deal was kind of in its latter stages, you had Foreign Minister Lavrov, you had basically the foreign ministers of all the countries represented, but the Chinese had gone to a very low level because this process just kept dragging on. So they were not as kind of a driving force in the process towards the end, unlike the Russians, who were sort of coaching the Iranians. They were kind of the Iranian ally at the negotiating table. But I do think the Russians were playing a bit of a double game because they did have this kind of growing alliance with Iran, certainly in Syria, which we've seen. And since the deal is done, the Russians have come out with a bunch of weapons deals with Iran, these S-300 missile systems. So, I think both the Russians and the Chinese were sort of constructive players in some ways, but they definitely had their own agendas in the longer term. And I didn't always. Sometimes Kerry would discuss or describe the Russians almost as an ally in this process, and I always thought they were playing much more of a double game.
We have a question right here.
That's a good segue because during the campaign, Trump
has said that he wanted to improve relations with Russia. In fact, there's some evidence that Russia even helped him with the election. So I'm wondering, talk about the relationship of Russia with Iran and in the sphere of the Middle East. You think they could play a positive catalyst there to relieve tension in the Middle East?
The Russians.
Yes.
I mean, the Russian-Iranian kind of alliance over the past few years has been pretty interesting, because if you go back, historically, the Persian Empire and the Russians were not the czars. They were, the Russians had carved out parts of Greater Persia. So there's a great historical kind of animosity in a lot of ways. But gosh, when you see what's happened over the past few years, like I was describing in the book, the Russians and the Iranians were having these secret talks back in Moscow about how to defend the Assad regime, to the point where a few months ago, the Russians were actually launching airstrikes from Iranian territory. And if you've talked to any, even an Iranian American, there's such a sense of nationalism there. The fact that they would let the Russians back in, even for a short time, was pretty, it shows how seriously they were worried about losing Assad and how seriously they were taking the war in Syria. I guess what's always been this dilemma is, on the surface, the Russians and the Iranians, it looks like there's some sort of confluence in that everyone wants to wipe out ISIS, and there could be some convergence of interest there. But what the Russians have been doing in a lot of ways was wiping out everyone but ISIS. They were hitting the rebel groups that the US or the CIA was financing. They were, wiping out these groups in just carpet bombing civilians. Meanwhile, the Islamic State in other parts of Syria have not been as targeted. So I don't know. I think it's been pretty remarkable in the last kind of year, as the U.S. has pushed back and the Russians have taken such a central role, that traditional allies like Egypt or Jordan, keep talking to the Russians and kind of see the Russians in a lot of ways as the big power player there, because unlike us, they were willing to deploy so much military capability there. But I'm still pretty skeptical that Donald Trump's going to be much more successful. I mean, I think people don't realize just how much the Obama administration tried to, in some ways, create some common operation in Syria, but the Russians kept targeting people we had been supporting. So I guess I just wonder how long this honeymoon period is Trump going to try to do this, and Putin's going to go behind his back and he's going to sort of really become antagonistic, or maybe he's hinted at basically pulling all U.S. support for any of these rebel groups in Syria, which is what the Russians have been asking for. If he does that, maybe there is some kind of short-term cooperation, but I'm still pretty skeptical that the Russian interest in that region, as this gentleman was saying, is necessarily the same as ours.
We have a question right here.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. Certainly, President Obama has focused on Iran and possibly ignoring the other conflicts going on around him. Do you feel he has done as good a job as possible as president? And if you were president, what would you have done differently?
But I do think that is a good question, because there has been this idea, like, God, he spent so much time on this Iran issue that he ignored, he basically sucked the air out of all these other, whether it was the Asian region or Latin America. I think that's a legitimate issue. But I do think when Obama came into power, these Middle East wars were burning, and he was elected basically to get the United States out. So it's certainly in the book, I'm not critical of what the strategy was. I think in a lot of ways it was really well executed. I think where it failed was that at some point they kind of boxed themselves into a corner where they basically had to be in agreement. Like there was no other option, and the Iranians knew that and took advantage of it. And because of that, I don't think he demanded the types of terms of a deal, which I think they could have leveraged the Iranians out. I think, basically letting them have a missile program or weakening the UN structure to the point where they can basically do as they wish. The fact that the weapon issue was basically buried, the fact that there is a sunset of these restrictions in 10 years, the fact that they gave ground, I think you can't just blame Republican intransigence. I think the terms were weak enough that it really does open them up to being, targeted or questioned when Trump takes over. And people forget that in the debate in Congress, the 3 top Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted against the deal. So I don't begrudge him, or I'm not critical of what the strategy was. I think the execution and the tactics in the end were probably wanting, and I forgot which diplomat I was talking to, but someone described what James Baker was like when he was a diplomat. He'd show up in a room kind of pissed off. Everyone knew he didn't want to be there, and everyone knew this guy was going to walk. That was in the back of their mind, and because of that, he was a very good negotiator. I always got the sense that when John Kerry showed up in the room, everyone knew this was the last guy who was going to walk, and people played off that, and I think that's why the deal is vulnerable despite the unbelievable amount of effort and time they put into negotiating it.
We have a question right here.
Yes, thank you very much. You alluded to the relationship with Iran and Hezbollah, supplying weapons, I assume, to Hezbollah in the war against Assad, or for Assad. Mm-hmm. How do you think that may destabilize the Israeli-Hezbollah situation?
Well, I mean, if you looked at the war in 2006, I forgot how many missiles Hezbollah shot at Israel at the time, but it was a lot. And, they've completely rearmed. And I guess I was in Israel about 6 weeks ago on the Golan Heights, looking down, and it's amazing because you look across the region. In the north, Syrian forces, in kind of directly across is the Nusra Front, which is like an Al-Qaeda element, and then to the south is ISIS. But Israeli defense officials say for the first time they've started to see Hezbollah and IRG, Revolutionary Guard soldiers or commanders looking up from the other side of the Golan. And that's very worrying to them because, the Iranians basically have a straight path now from Tehran through Iraq, through Syria to the Mediterranean, which they didn't have a few years ago. And whether it's shipping arms to Hezbollah or having their own presence now in Syria at a much greater and larger level than they used to, that is a security threat for Israel that wasn't there a few years ago, and it shows how Iran really has benefited in a lot of ways from all of this instability. And I remember I went back looking at the invasion of Iraq, because I think there was a perception back in 2003 that the Israelis, they wanted this war, and I think maybe there were elements that did, but I think there were a lot of members of the Israeli Defense Forces were like, God, if you get rid of Saddam, Iran is basically moving, hundreds and hundreds of miles closer to our border, and they were very worried about that. And I think the concerns have basically borne out because Iran has just so much more influence and are so much more deployed now in Iraq and Syria than they were.
Thank you, Jay. Please give Jay a round of applause.